Part 1, the saw that wasn't built yet, Rabaul Midnight, March 1943. Rear Admirals Masatomi Kimura stood on the bridge wing of the destroyer Shirayuki and watched 8 transport ships slide out of Simpson Harbor into the dark. He was 52 years old. His face had been carved by 2 decades of tropical sun and by the particular kind of weariness that comes not from exhaustion, but from responsibility. He had commanded destroyers at Guadalcanal. He had seen men die in water that turned black before dawn. He understood the sea in the way that only men who have lost things to it truly do. He counted his escorts, 8 destroyers. He noted the weight of the transport, riding low and heavy in the water, loaded past Comfort with 6,900 soldiers of the 51st Division of the Imperial Japanese Army. Men who had been waiting 6 weeks in Rabaul for this night. Men who had written letters home, men who had prayed or gambled, or sat in silence, staring at the harbor and thinking about the distance between themselves and wherever they had come from. Their destination was La, on the northeastern coast of New Guinea. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi was waiting for them there. His garrison was running low on everything that keeps men alive and fighting. These 6,900 soldiers were the answer to his need. Kimura had reasons to believe in this mission. They were not small reasons. They were built from more than a year of evidence. American high-altitude bombers had been trying to sink Japanese ships since the beginning of the war in the Pacific, and their record was almost embarrassing to describe. Bombs fell from 20,000 feet and vanished into empty ocean. Ships turned and lived. The doctrine of the Imperial Navy held that a convoy protected by destroyers, screened by fighters above, was effectively safe from air attack. The anti-aircraft umbrella worked. It had always worked. Kimura stood on the bridge and watched the last transport clear the harbor mouth, and he allowed himself the smallest, most professional version of confidence. He had done everything correctly. The convoy would hug the weather front coming down from New Britain, 2 days inside the cloud and rain. By the time the skies cleared, they would be within range of 0 fighters flying out of Leh itself. The Americans would find nothing until it was too late to matter. What Kimura could not know, what no intelligence report had told him, what no officer in Rabaul had thought to warn him about, was what had been happening for the past 7 months in a corrugated iron shed outside Brisbane, Australia. He did not know about the mechanic. The mechanic's name was Paul Irvin Gunn. He was 43 years old. He had served 21 years in the United States Navy, risen to chief petty officer, earned his wings as a naval aviator, and then gone civilian, flying commercial routes across the Philippines in the years before the war. He was lean and grey at the temples, and his face carried the kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep repairs. His fellow officers in the Army Air Forces called him Pappy. He hated the nickname. He kept it because it hurt less than thinking about the reason it no longer fit. Here is what you need to understand about Paul Gunn, because everything that follows depends on it. He was not fighting for his country. He was not driven by ideology or duty or the abstractions that fill the speeches of generals. He was fighting because of 5 specific people, and the fact that those 5 people were, at this moment, starving inside a Japanese internment camp at Santo Tomas University in Manila. Their names were Polly, Natalie, Julie, Paul Jr., and Connie. Polly was his wife. The others were his children. He had brought them to the Philippines himself. He had moved them from the safety of the United States because he loved them and could not bear to be separated from them. That was the whole of it. That love had placed them inside a wall, and the men who had built that wall were the men he was trying to kill. Every night, in every bunk, on every base from Darwin to Port Moresby to Brisbane, Paul Gunn lay awake and thought about that wall. He did not think about victory. He did not think about the Pacific War or the fate of nations. He thought about a wall 2,000 miles to the north and 5 faces on the other side of it, and what it was taking to get to them. He worked instead of sleeping. He worked until his hands cramped and his eyes burned, and the mechanics under him begged him to stop. He worked because work was the only space in which his mind could go that did not collapse into grief. What he was building in that corrugated iron shed at Eagle Farm Airfield outside Brisbane was something no military manual had ever described and no factory in America had yet imagined. He was turning a bomber into a saw. The aircraft was a B-25 Mitchell, a twin-engine medium bomber that had been designed to drop bombs from altitude onto targets below. It was a competent, respected aircraft. It was not what Gunn needed. Gunn needed something that could fly low enough to look a ship in the eye and kill it before the ship's guns could respond. He needed a weapon that could suppress the anti-aircraft crews on a destroyer's deck long enough for a bomb to find the hull. He started by tearing out the bombardier's station in the nose, the transparent plexiglass cone at the front of the airplane, the seat and sighting equipment that gave the B-25 its purpose according to every doctrine ever written, gone. Into the space left behind, he installed 450 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, their barrels pointing straight ahead, then 4 more. 8 guns in the nose of a medium bomber, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute, each round weighing nearly 2 ounces of hardened steel and copper and fire. The mathematics were straightforward and terrifying. 8 guns firing simultaneously could throw roughly 6,800 rounds per minute at a target directly ahead of the aircraft. Every 5th round was a tracer, burning bright enough to see in daylight. Every 2nd round was armor-piercing incendiary, designed to punch through steel and set what it found on the other side on fire. The first time they tried to fly the modified aircraft, the weight distribution was wrong. The nose was heavy. The airplane handled like a falling stone. Gunn and Jack Fox, a quiet 35-year-old civilian technical representative from North American aviation who had come to Australia to service airplanes and ended up helping to reinvent them, added counterweights to the tail. They reinforced the nose structure with steel plates salvaged from wrecked aircraft. They rerouted hydraulic lines and rewired the firing solenoids so that one pilot, alone in the cockpit, could unleash all 8 guns with a single press of his thumb. What emerged from that shed was no longer a bomber. It was a weapon without a name. It was 6,800 rounds per minute, mounted on wings, capable of arriving at the height of a ship's deck at 280 miles per hour. It was the answer to a question that Japanese naval doctrine had not thought to ask. Jack Fox, who had helped build it, disappears from the historical record shortly after. He was one of thousands of men who made essential things possible in that war and left no further trace. The thing he helped make, however, was about to change the course of the Pacific campaign. But first, someone had to decide to use it. That someone was General George Kenny. Kenny was 53 years old, small and sharp-eyed, a veteran of the First World War, who had spent the years between the wars thinking about what air power could actually do when used by men willing to ignore what the manuals said. He arrived in Australia in August of 1942 to take command of what would become the 5th Air Force, and within days of his arrival, he had begun touring maintenance depots, looking for people who were doing things that weren't in any manual. At Eagle Farm, he found Pappy gun covered in oil welding gun mounts into the nose of an aircraft with no authorization from any engineer or bureaucrat in Washington. Another commander might have stopped him. Kenny stood and watched for several minutes without speaking. Then he asked Gunn what he was building. Gunn told him. He explained the low-level approach, the suppression of anti-aircraft fire, the skip bombing technique he had heard about from a young officer named William Benn, who was developing it separately in New Guinea. He explained all of it in the flat, tired voice of a man who had made this argument too many times to officers who had already decided the answer before he finished speaking. Kenny listened. When Gunn finished, the general said only 2 words. Keep going. No budget, no formal authorization, no approval from Washington. 2 words, and the saw kept cutting. Port 2, the cost of learning how to kill. Before the saw could cut, someone had to teach men how to aim it. That someone was William Benn. Benn was approximately 32 years old, though the records are imprecise. What is precise is his obsession. He had read a classified British report about experiments with bouncing bombs against canal locks in Europe. The experiments were early and only partially successful, but Benn looked past the results to the physics underneath them. A heavy object released at the right angle, at the right speed, at the right altitude will skip across water the same way a flat stone skips when thrown by a practiced hand. Not once, twice, sometimes 3 times. And on its final contact with a vertical surface, that object will transfer everything it carries into whatever is on the other side of that surface. He found a target, the S-Pruth, a merchant ship that had run aground on a coral reef off the coast of Port Moresby and been left there, rusting and half-submerged, useful to no one. Ben began flying B-17 flying fortresses over it at 200 feet, releasing 500-pound bombs, watching where they went, adjusting. He changed his altitude by 10 feet, he changed his airspeed by 15 knots, he changed the moment of release by fractions of a second. He did this again and again for weeks, until the bomb left the aircraft, struck the water once, skipped it, struck again, and drove itself into the hull of the wreck with the reliability of a practiced craft. He called it skip bombing. He wrote a training manual. He taught the method to pilots in the 63rd Bombardment Squadron, and General Kenny, watching from Brisbane, understood immediately what he had. He had a mechanic in Australia building airplanes that could fly at wave-top height and suppress anti-aircraft fire with 8 forward-firing machine guns. He had a pilot in New Guinea teaching men how to place 500-pound bombs into moving ship hulls from that same altitude. Put those 2 ideas together, and the Japanese merchant marine would cease to exist as a fighting force. There was only one problem. The war moved faster than anyone planned. On January 18, 1,000 943, William Benn climbed into a B-17 Flying Fortress alone for a reconnaissance flight along the northern coast of New Guinea. He did not come back. Search flights went out for weeks. They found nothing. No wreckage, no parachute, no emergency signal, no body. William Benn, the man who had spent months learning how to skip a bomb across the ocean and teaching others to do the same, simply ceased to exist. The Pacific took him and left no record of the moment it happened. His squadron went quiet for a day. Then they went back to work. A 27-year-old major named Ed Larner took command of the 90th Bombardment Squadron, the unit that flew Pappy Gunn's modified B-25s. Larner was tall and aggressive and, according to the men who flew with him, unafraid to a degree that made people who cared about him quietly nervous. He had inherited two things simultaneously, Benn's technique and Gunn's weapon. And through the weeks of January and into February, as he trained his pilots and studied his maps, he began to understand what those two inheritances could do together. The training was brutal and exact. Larner's pilots flew practice runs against target sleds towed behind boats in the Coral Sea, learning to hold their aircraft at 100 feet above the water at 280 miles per hour, to hold that altitude with absolute steadiness, while approaching a moving target, to open fire at 1,500 yards and hold the trigger down through the closing distance, to release their bombs at 600 yards from the target with 5-second delay fuses that would carry the bomb through the ship's hull and detonate it inside. The Australian Beaufighter crews of No. 30 Squadron flew alongside them, refining their own approach angles and timing until the coordination between units was as precise as a piece of music. Meanwhile, in a room in Brisbane, General Kenny received something that changed the nature of everything being prepared. The intelligence came from Ultra, the Allied signals intelligence operation that had broken the Japanese naval code. What Ultra delivered to Kenny in the last days of February 1943 was not a suspicion or an estimate. It was a fact. The Japanese were preparing to send a major convoy from Rabaul to Lae. Kenny knew the date of departure. He knew the route. He knew the number of transport ships, the number of escort destroyers, the number of soldier ships. He knew all of it before a single Japanese sailor had raised an anchor. Rear Admiral Kimura believed he was hiding his convoy in bad weather, executing a plan that enemy reconnaissance would fail to detect until it was too late. He was not hiding, he was being watched. He had been watched before the first ship left the harbor. The convoy that sailed from Rabaul at midnight on March 1 was not sailing into uncertainty. It was sailing into a trap that had been built around it before it existed. The convoy steamed east and then curved north around the tip of New Britain, staying close to the coast where a weather front hung low and grey over the sea. Kimura stood on the bridge of the Shirayuki and studied the cloud cover with professional satisfaction. He had chosen this route for exactly this reason. The overcast was thick and low. American reconnaissance aircraft would find nothing. On the afternoon of March 1, in a small tier in the clouds 200 miles north of New Britain, a B-24 Liberator crossed the sky. Pilot was Lieutenant Walter Higgins. He was 24 years old. He was tired and he was 45 minutes from turning back to base, and he was looking down through a ragged break in the overcast when he saw them. 16 dark shapes on grey water, white wakes cutting the surface like knife strokes. He counted them twice. He radioed Port Moresby and gave the coordinates. Then he turned for home. There was nothing dramatic about it. A tired young man looked down at the right moment, counted what he saw, called it in, and flew home. That was enough. At Port Moresby, the message arrived within the hour. The convoy had been found. The clock had started that night in the ready rooms and the tents and the mess halls where the crews of the 5th Air Force slept or tried to sleep. The word passed. Ed Larner walked out to the flight line in the dark and stood alone beside his B-25. The aircraft was named Ruthless. The nose was flat, olive drab in the darkness. The 8 gun barrels sat in their mounts, waiting. Larner did not touch the airplane. He stood and looked at it for a long time. Then he went back to his tent. He did not sleep. At dawn on March 2, 17 Flying Fortresses of the 63rd Squadron found the convoy through a break in the weather and began their runs from 7,000 feet. Most of the bombs missed. This was expected. This was the entire point of Kenny's plan. The high-altitude attack was not meant to sink the convoy. It was meant to test the Japanese response and preserve the element of surprise for what was coming. But one bomb did not miss. The transport Kyokusei Maru took a direct hit. She had been carrying more than 1,000 soldiers. She burned for less than an hour and went down. The destroyers Yukikaze and Asagumo moved in and pulled roughly 800 men from the water. Then they broke away from the convoy at high speed and raced ahead to Lae to deliver the survivors. They arrived that night, unloaded the men, and turned around to rejoin the convoy. Those 800 soldiers were the only reinforcements that would ever reach Lae. On the deck of the transport, Teo Maru, a 22-year-old infantry private from Kochi Prefecture, watched the smoke from Kyokusei Maru rise on the horizon. He had never seen a ship sink before. He had never seen a man die. He held the rail with both hands and could not stop shaking. A sergeant told him to stop behaving like a child. He tried. He could not. That night, an officer came through the holds and told the soldiers that the Americans had missed their chance. The weather was closing back in. By tomorrow evening, they would be on land and safe. Private lay in his hammock in the dark and listened to the engines throb through the steel of the hull. He thought about his mother's garden. He thought about the smell of rice. He fell asleep sometime after midnight. He would wake to the sound of aircraft engines at 10 o'clock in the morning. Kenny issued his orders for March 3 before the sun came up. Everything, every aircraft available, every crew. The full weight of the 5th Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force delivered in one coordinated blow from 3 altitudes at once. At the top, 7,000 feet, 13 B-17 flying fortresses. Their real job was not to hit anything. Their real job was to make every anti-aircraft gunner in the convoy tilt his weapon upward and stare into the sun. In the middle, coming in from the southwest, crossing from 2,000 feet down to wave-top height in the final seconds of approach, 13 Beaufighter heavy fighters of No. 30 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force. Each carried 4 20mm cannon and 6 machine guns. And below them, at 100 feet above the surface of the Bismarck Sea, 12 B-25 Mitchells of Ed Larner's 90th Bombardment Squadron. Each aircraft carried 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns in the nose. Each aircraft carried 3,000 pounds of 500-pound bombs fitted with 5-second delay fuses. They would fly at 280 miles per hour, 100 feet above the water, straight at the sides of the ships. They would not stop until it was finished. The morning of March 3 came clear. The convoy had emerged from the weather front and was crossing open water. The coast of New Guinea now visible to the south. The fighter fields at Lai, close enough that the officers allowed themselves to believe the worst was behind them. The private from Kochi was on the deck of Teo Maru when the alarm sounded. He heard the roar first, high above, and looked up and saw the tiny silver shapes of the B-17s catching the morning sun. He watched the Japanese gunners around him swing their 25mm cannons upward and open fire. The tracers climbed in bright lines toward the high bombers. Someone laughed. Someone slapped him on the shoulder and told him to watch, because the American cowards were going to bomb from a mile up and hit nothing again. He did not see the Beaufighters. He did not see them because they were coming out of the southwest at the exact height of the wave tops, so low that salt spray beaded on their windscreens. They came in without warning because the sound of their engines had not yet arrived. One moment, the southwest horizon was empty. The next moment, it was full of aircraft that should not have been there. On the bridge of the destroyer Shirayuki, a lookout finally saw them and shouted a warning, but the word he shouted was wrong. He shouted both. He meant the Bristol Beaufort torpedo bomber, a different aircraft entirely, an aircraft designed to launch torpedoes into ships from the side. He was wrong. He would never have the chance to correct the mistake. But the damage the word caused was catastrophic. Every officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy had been trained to respond to a torpedo attack in exactly one way: turn the bow of the ship directly toward the incoming aircraft to present the narrowest possible target to the torpedo. It was doctrine. It was drilled. It was reflex. And so when the cry of Beaufort went up along the convoy, ship after ship after ship began to swing her bow around toward the southwest, toward the Beaufighters, toward the guns. The Beaufighters were not carrying torpedoes. The Beaufighters were carrying 4 20mm cannon and 6 machine guns, all of them pointing forward, and the ships had just turned themselves into perfect targets. Bow to stern, their entire lengths exposed to weapons that fired straight ahead. The first burst of Beaufighter cannon fire tore into the bridge of the destroyer Shirayuki at 10:03. In the morning, Admiral Kimura was thrown against the bulkhead by the impact. The bridge glass shattered. His signalman went down without a sound. The captain of the ship, who had been standing beside him a moment before, was simply gone. Then Ed Larner. Larner brought Ruthless down to 100 feet, 280 miles per hour. The engines were shaking the airframe. The 8 guns in the nose sat cold and waiting. His thumb rested on the firing button. His eyes were fixed on Shirayuki. He could see men running on the deck. He could see the tracers still climbing upward toward the B-17s, the gunners still staring at the wrong altitude, still fighting the wrong threat. 1,500 yards, he pressed the button. 8 50-caliber machine guns fired simultaneously. The recoil hammered the nose of the aircraft back against his spine. 6,800 rounds per minute poured out of Ruthless in a single unbroken stream. Every 5th round was a tracer. Every 2nd round was armor-piercing incendiary. The space between the aircraft and the destroyer became a solid rope of light. The rope reached the bridge of the Shirayuki. The bridge did not explode. It disassembled. The steel of the superstructure came apart in pieces. The gun tubs behind the bridge, where Kimura's anti-aircraft crews were desperately trying to depress their weapons to meet this new low-altitude threat. Filled with light so bright it looked white. Men who had been standing at their stations a moment before were simply not there anymore. Kimura crawled across broken glass and pieces of men and did not look at what he was crawling through. Lana held the trigger for 6 seconds, 600 rounds. Then he released his bombs. 2 500-pounders left the bomb bay at exactly 600 yards from Shirayuki's hull. They struck the water. Once they skipped, they struck again. They drove into the destroyer's flank, just below the waterline. The 5-second fuses did their work. The bombs detonated inside the ship. Shirayuki broke. The blast cracked her keel, her stern lifted, her bow drove down into the sea. She began to die within 30 seconds of Lana passing over her. Behind Lana, the 11 other B-25s of the 90th Squadron were choosing their targets. Lieutenant John Hennebury was 24 years old and flying a B-25 that his squadron called the Hag. He picked the transport Teo Maru because she was the largest ship still moving. He brought the Hag down to 80 feet and lined up on her port side. On the deck of Teo Maru, the 22-year-old private from Kochi saw it coming. He would remember for the rest of his life that it did not look like an airplane. It looked like a shape made of noise. The sound arrived before the shape did, a mechanical shriek that filled the entire sky. And then the shape came out of the sound, low over the water, with 8 small suns burning in its face. Those were the muzzle flashes of Hennebury's guns. The private threw himself flat on the deck. The man beside him, a sergeant, was reaching for a rifle when the first burst of 50 caliber fire crossed the deck of Teo Maru at chest height. The rounds walked from bow to stern in less than 3 seconds. The private felt the deck plates jump beneath him. Something wet struck the side of his face. He crawled. He crawled toward the rail because the rail was the only direction he could think of. When Hennebury's bombs hit, the Hag was already climbing away. The bombs skipped once and drove into the ship's midship section. Teo Maru convulsed. A wall of flame rose from the forward cargo hatch where ammunition had been stored, and the deck beneath the private's body tilted upward like the lid of a box, being forced open from below. He fell into the sea. The killing continued for 15 minutes. Lieutenant Roy Moore in Chatterbox attacked the transport Oyo Maru from the beam. His 8 guns caught the ship broadside. His skip bombs broke her hull. She sank in under 12 minutes. Lieutenant Charles Howe attacked the destroyer Arashio, whose captain had turned his warship broadside to shield the transports behind him, an act of deliberate and professional sacrifice. Howe's guns and bombs left Arashio a burning hulk. She drifted into the transport Nojima in her death. The 2 ships locked together and burned as one. By 10:20 in the morning, 37 minutes after Lana first pressed the trigger, 7 of the 8 transport ships were sinking, burning, or already gone. Shirayuki had broken in half, Arashio was dying, the destroyer Tokitsukaze was going down, the destroyer Asashio, hit repeatedly by strafing runs, finally exploded when fire reached her magazines. Kimura was pulled from the wreck of Shirayuki by a whaleboat from the destroyer Shikinami. He transferred his flag, he was still alive, he was 52 years old, he had just watched the largest single loss of Japanese soldiers to air attack in the history of the Pacific War. He did not sleep that night. In the water, the private from Kochi had come up under a slick of burning oil, gone back down, and come up again in a clear patch. He grabbed a floating plank. He was burned along his left arm. He could not feel his left leg. The private saw an officer in a white uniform kneel on the ship's flank as she rolled and bow his head. He did not know who the officer was. He watched the man vanish beneath the water without moving. Then the private was alone with the plank. There were other men in the water around him. Hundreds of them. Perhaps 1,000. They called out to each other in the smoke. Some had life jackets, some had pieces of wreckage, some had nothing at all. And after a time, the voices began to organize themselves, the living began to find each other, and the private kicked through the water until a hand reached down from a broken section of hatch cover and pulled him up. He lay there gasping. Beside him, a corporal wept without sound. The Bismarck Sea was warm. The air smelled of oil and burned things. Above them, the last American aircraft of the first wave were climbing south, growing small in the sky. The private thought it was over. It was not over. The next morning, March 4, the American aircraft came back. They came back to the same patch of ocean where the Asikamadreps, the Trafts, and the men and the pieces of ships still floated in the sunlight. They came down low, and they opened fire. The orders had come from Kenny. They were given verbally without paper. They said that the men in the water were reinforcements for New Guinea. They said that any man who reached the jungle would fight there, would kill American soldiers there, and would have to be killed again at far greater cost. They said that the war did not stop because a man had lost his ship. Not every pilot obeyed. John Hennebury, who had flown Teomaru and watched it burn, flew over the survivors on Sort 4 and could not bring himself to fire. He wrote about this in his memoirs decades later. Some of his fellow pilots did fire. PT boats from Tufi moved through the debris fields. They pulled a small number of Japanese officers from the water alive for interrogation. The rest they left behind. The historians have argued about what happened on March 4 and 5 for 80 years. Some call it a war crime. Some call it a hard necessity. Some have refused to address it at all. But no one who was there, on either side of those guns, ever forgot it. The Bismarck Sea gave no easy answers. It only gave the dead and the silence that came after, and the men who had to carry both. Horp 3, what a sore leaves behind. On the night of March 5, Japanese submarines crept through the darkness to the coordinates of the battle. They surfaced in the debris field and took on survivors. The young private from Kochi was among approximately 2,700 men eventually returned to Rabaul from the 6,900 who had sailed. Another 1,200, mostly rescued from the Kyokusei Maru on the first day, had already been delivered to Leh. The remaining 3,000 died in the water, on the burning transports, or beneath the guns of aircraft that came back to finish the work. Private went home to Kochi Prefecture after the war. He became an old man, and for the rest of his life, he'd never stood on a beach without looking at the sky first. In Leh, Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi read the order that arrived from Tokyo 2 days after the battle. It was precise and it was final. The use of large transport ships to reinforce Leh was forbidden. From this point forward, men and supplies bound for New Guinea would travel only by submarine or by small barge, moving at night. Adachi was 53 years old, a soldier of the old school, and he understood exactly what had been placed in his hands. He understood that an empire built on distant islands cannot be sustained a barge at a time. In the months that followed, his soldiers ate their stores of rice. When the rice was gone, they ate their pack animals. When the animals were gone, they ate their leather belts. When they were finally ordered to evacuate Leh in September of 1943, there were no ships to carry them. There were only their boots and the mountains that waited to the north. They walked into the Finisterre Range through jungle that killed men with fever and leeches and rain that never stopped. Thousands of them died on that trail without ever encountering an American soldier. Their bones are still in that jungle today. The battle over the Bismarck Sea had lasted 15 minutes. It took nearly a year to finish killing people on the ground. Rear Admiral Kimura returned to Japan. He was not court-martialed, he was not publicly disgraced. The Imperial Navy, protective of its officer corps and determined to conceal the scale of the disaster from the Japanese public, quietly reassigned him to shore duty and training commands. He never again commanded a combat force at sea. He lived through the rest of the war. He lived through the American occupation. He lived, in fact, until 1960, 17 years after the Bismarck Sea, and he died of natural causes in a small house near Tokyo. He gave no interviews. He wrote no memoirs. He said nothing, publicly or on record, about what he had seen from the bridge of a burning destroyer on the morning of March 3, 1943. The last officer alive who had watched an entire division disappear into the ocean carried his silence to the grave and offered it to no one. What he thought about in those 17 years, in the mornings, when the light came through the windows of that small house near Tokyo, no one has ever recorded. In April 1943, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, launched a massive aerial counteroffensive called Operation Igo, intended to restore Japanese momentum in the South Pacific. It achieved almost nothing. Yamamoto flew forward to Rabaul to see the results for himself. On April 18, 7 weeks after the Bismarck Sea, his aircraft was shot down over Bougainville by American P-38 Lightnings, guided to his exact location by codebreakers. There is no evidence that the loss at the Bismarck Sea directly caused Yamamoto to make the flight that killed him. But the war he was flying into, the war he was trying to hold together with a counter-offensive that failed, was the war that 12 B-25s had rewritten in 15 minutes over open water. Then came the news that no one was prepared for. Ed Lana was 27 years old on April 28, 1943. He was flying a routine mission near Doadura on the north coast of New Guinea in a B-25 designated Spook 2. The weather was clear. There was no enemy contact. The aircraft struck the ground and killed everyone aboard. Some investigators later suggested, though never proved, that the weight distribution of the Strafer modification, the 8 guns in the nose and their ammunition load, may have contributed to an instability that became fatal. It was never proven. The investigation reached no firm conclusion. The war did not require firm conclusions to take a man from the people who had known him. It only required his name and a moment when no one was watching. Lana's squadron flew his empty aircraft slot for one mission. Then they filled it with a replacement pilot and kept working. The saw kept cutting. It did not pause for the men who had made it sharp. By the middle of 1943, 3 full bombardment groups had been converted to the Strafer configuration. In August, the 3 and 45th Bombardment Group arrived in theater with brand new aircraft. In November, they helped tear apart the Japanese anchorage at Rabaul in a single afternoon. By 1944, the factory in Kansas City was producing the B-25J model with 12 to 18 forward-firing machine guns as standard equipment. Pappy Gunn's field modification, built without authorization in a corrugated iron shed in Brisbane, had become the airplane. Japanese daylight shipping in the South Pacific effectively ceased. Garrisons on distant islands began to starve. In classified reports written for internal use, Japanese naval staff described the American Strafer bomber as the single most feared weapon in the theater. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukutome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, later wrote in his memoirs that the loss of maritime supply, the slow strangulation of Japan's outer empire, had done more to defeat Japan than the atomic bombs. That strangulation had a starting point. It had a date. It was March 3, 1943. Pappy Gunn worked through the rest of the war. He was promoted, he was wounded, he was hospitalized, he got out of the hospital and went back to his workshop. He designed new gun packages, new attack profiles, new methods of killing things that needed to be killed. He became a legend within the 5th Air Force, a rumpled, relentless major whom generals listened to and factories eventually obeyed. And every night when the war permitted, he thought about a wall in Manila. In February of 1945, American troops broke through the gates of Santo Tomas University. They found Polly Gunn and Natalie and Julie and Paul Jr. and Connie alive. Thin, sick, but alive. Pappy Gunn flew into Manila the day after they were freed. He walked through the gate of Santo Tomas in his flight suit. Polly saw him coming across the courtyard and she walked toward him. They stopped in front of each other in the open air of the prison yard. Neither of them said anything for a long time. He'd built machines for this moment. He had welded steel and argued with generals and killed men from one end of the Pacific to the other for this moment. He had lain awake in 100 bunks in 100 different places, thinking about 5 faces on the other side of a wall, and now the wall was behind him and the faces were in front of him. The war ended in August of 1945. Paul Irvin Gunn survived it. He stayed in the fleet and went back to what he had done before the war, flying commercial routes across the islands where he had once fought. Polly stayed with him. The children grew up. The years passed, one into the next, the way years do when the thing you were afraid of losing has been returned to you. On October 11, 1957, Pappy Gunn was flying a small commercial aircraft through a storm near Manila when he lost control in bad weather. The aircraft went down. He was 62 years old. Had tried to wear him down. He survived all of it. And then, on a routine flight in the country, he had spent the best years of his life trying to reach. An ordinary storm killed him. The family he had built the saw for had come home, and then the man who had built the saw had gone. What he left behind is still in service. The AC-47 spooky gunship that flew over the Mekong Delta in 1965 was a transport aircraft turned into a flying weapon by men who had read about what Gunn had done. The AC-130 Spectre that flew over Cambodia and Kuwait and Afghanistan carried the same fundamental idea at larger scale. The A-10 Warthog, with its 30mm cannon built specifically to fly low and slow and kill things on the ground, carries in its design the logic of a man who understood that sometimes the only way to destroy something is to look it in the eye. All of them, in a real sense, are grandchildren of 850 caliber machine guns bolted into the nose of a B-25 Mitchell by a mechanic in Brisbane who could not sleep because of what had been done to his family. 6,900 Japanese soldiers sailed from Rabaul on the night of March 1, 1943. Approximately 2,700 were eventually returned to Rabaul. Approximately 1,200 reached late. The remaining 3,000 died in the water, on the ships, or beneath the guns of aircraft that returned to make certain the job was finished. They died because a mechanic in Australia would not sleep. They died because a general in Brisbane was willing to say 2 words to a man covered in oil who was doing something no manual had ever described. And they died because a young major in Port Moresby was willing to fly 100 feet above the ocean at 280 miles per hour straight into the faces of their guns. They died because the American military in this particular moment of the war was willing to let men who saw clearly break the rules that blind men had written. They died in the end because their empire had built itself on distant islands surrounded by sea, and someone had finally figured out how to cut through the sea to reach them, and nothing in the Pacific was ever the same again.